The fence post exploded into splinters under the axe, and Calvin Warren's breath caught in his throat as he watched 3 days of work die in a single stroke. The orc woman who had swung it did not even look at what she had destroyed. She was already turning toward him, her green eyes sharp as broken glass, the muscles along her bare forearms still coiled from the blow. She stood well over 6 feet, built like something carved rather than born, in fitted black leather armor that hugged the strong lines of her body. A laced bodice of dark hide over a crimson underlayer, banded steel vambraces strapped to each forearm, a wide belt slung low across her hips that carried the broad-bladed axe she had just used to gut his fence. Her black hair was bound back in a single thick braid, and 2 curved tusks rose from her lower jaw, pale against the deep green of her skin. "You are Calvin Warren," she said. It was not a question. "I am." He kept his hands loose at his sides, though every part of him wanted to reach for the hammer resting against the forged stone 10 feet away. "And you've just cost me a day's work on that fence. I have been paid to cost you a good deal more than that." Her voice was low, rough, almost bored, as if she had said the same words to a dozen men before him and expected the same result. "Josiah Prout wants this ridge empty by the first frost. He hired me to see that it is." Calvin looked past her, out at the ruined walls of the old fort that climbed the spine of the ridge behind his cabin, broken stone towers, a collapsed gatehouse, the bones of something that had once mattered to somebody, long before he'd staked his claim here. Then he looked back at her, at the axe still dripping splinters, at the calm and terrible patience in the way she stood. "I'm not leaving," he said. Something flickered behind her eyes, not anger, something closer to surprise, quickly buried. "Most men run before I finish the first sentence. I'm not most men." "No," she agreed, tilting her head as she studied him, taking in the soot on his forearms, the burned scars along his knuckles, the steady way he held himself even with an orc enforcer standing in his yard with an axe in her hand. "You are a fool with a forge and no fence." She might have said more. She might have raised the axe again, toward the porch post, or the wagon, or the wellhead that stood between his cabin and the fort ruins, but that was the moment the ground gave a low groan, and a shout of pain tore up out of the earth itself. Calvin's blood went cold. "That's Tobias." He was already running before he finished the sentence, boots skidding on the frost-hard dirt, toward the low stone ring of the well he had spent the better part of a week trying to repair. His hired hand, an old settler named Tobias Fenn, who had agreed to help him clear the ruined fort for 2 silver a week, had gone down into the shaft that morning to clear a blockage near the bottom. Calvin reached the rim and looked down into darkness and saw nothing but a cloud of dust rising, heard nothing but a low, pained moaning from 20 feet below. "Tobias!" "My leg," the voice floated up, thin and frightened. "The wall gave way, Calvin. It's coming down around me." Even as the old man spoke, there was a grinding crack from somewhere deep in the stone, and a fresh shower of rubble rattled down the shaft. Calvin grabbed the rope coiled at the well's edge, the one he had used that morning to lower Tobias down, and found it far too short and far too thin to bear the weight of a man climbing hand over hand while stone rained down on him. He had no ladder long enough. He had no second man to brace the rope. He had nothing but his own 2 hands and a growing certainty that Tobias Fenn was going to die in the dark while he stood helpless at the rim. "Move." The word came from behind him, flat and final, and then the orc woman was there, shoving past him with a strength that nearly knocked him from his feet. She did not hesitate at the edge. She looped the rope twice around her own forearm, tested the give of the old stone rim with one hard stamp of her boot, and swung herself over the side without a single word of warning. "Wait," Calvin lunged forward, but she was already gone, dropping into the dark with the rope singing out behind her, her boots finding purchase against the rough stone walls in a controlled, practiced fall that no ordinary person could have managed. He heard her hit bottom, heard the crunch of settling debris, heard Tobias cry out in fear and then in something closer to disbelief. "Hold still, old man." Her voice rose up out of the shaft, muffled but clear. "I am not going to hurt you. I am going to get you out." Calvin knelt at the rim, straining to see, his heart slamming against his ribs. Snaga, he did not know how he knew her name, she had never given it. Perhaps Prout's men had spoken it in town, in warning, the way people spoke of storms and diseases. It came out of him now without thought, and later he would wonder at that, at how a name could arrive before an introduction, as if some part of him had already decided she mattered. Below him, stones shifted again and dust billowed up the shaft. He heard her grunt with effort, heard the distinct sound of rock being shoved aside by main strength rather than tool, and then Tobias's voice, weak but climbing toward relief. "She's got the beam off my leg." Lord above, she just lifted it. "Can he stand?" Calvin called down. "He will stand." There was something almost fierce in the way she said it, as though the old man's survival had become a point of personal pride. "Warren, drop the rope again, and do not let go of your end, whatever happens." He did as he was told. He felt the rope go taut, felt the strain of it bite into his palms as he braced his boots against the stone rim and leaned back with everything he had. And slowly, impossibly, Tobias Fenn rose up out of the darkness, hauled by an orc woman climbing one-handed beneath him, bracing his weight against her own shoulder, using the wall itself as a second set of hands. When they finally broke the surface, Calvin hauled the old man over the rim and laid him flat in the frost grass, and Snaga came up after him with the ease of someone stepping over a low fence, not even breathing hard. For a long moment nobody spoke. Tobias lay staring up at the gray autumn sky, clutching his bruised leg alive. Calvin knelt over him, checking the leg with careful hands, finding it battered but unbroken, and only then did he let himself look up at the woman who had just saved a man's life she had no reason to care about. She was watching him back, her chest rising and falling, dust streaked across one cheek, her green eyes unreadable. "You were hired to drive me off this ridge," Calvin said slowly, "not to climb into a collapsing well after a man you've never met." "I was hired to terrify you," she corrected. "I did not agree to let an old fool die screaming in the dark to do it." She wiped her hands on her thighs, leaving pale streaks of dust against the black leather. "Prout's coin does not buy that." "Thank you," Calvin said, and meant it with his whole chest. She looked at him for a long moment as if the words were an unfamiliar weight she did not know how to hold. Then she turned away, toward the well itself, and peered down into the ruined shaft with a frown creasing her heavy brow. "This well is why the old fort was built here," she said. "I have seen the maps Prout showed me. Whoever holds this water holds the ridge. That is why he wants you gone, not out of spite, but because he means to claim this spring for his own herds once you are frightened off it." She glanced back at Calvin. "Your walls have shifted. The whole shaft will come down within the week if it is not shored." "I know," he said grimly. "I've been trying to fix it for 3 days. I don't have the timber and I don't have the hands, and now I don't have Tobias either, not for a while." Snaga Rageborn looked down into the broken well, then back at the man standing before her, soot-stained, exhausted, more worried for his old hired hand than for the axe-wielding enforcer standing in his yard, and something in her calculations shifted, quiet and irrevocable, though she would not have named it that way herself. "Bring me the timber you have," she said, "and your hammer. I will show you what an orc's hands are actually good for." It took her the rest of that day, and most of the next, to do what she did. Calvin had never seen anyone work like her. She went down into the shaft 3 more times, each time bracing fresh stone with her own shoulders while he lowered timber down to her. And by the second evening she had reset the collapsed section wall by wall, packed the gaps with clay and rubble, and rigged a proper windlass over the top using a spare axle from his wagon and rope she had spliced herself. When she finally climbed out for the last time, hands raw, braid half undone, she looked less like the enforcer who had split his fence post and more like a woman who had simply done a hard day's honest work. "It will hold through winter," she said, dropping down onto the porch step beside him, wholly unself-conscious about the dirt and dust that now covered nearly all of her. Longer, if you reinforce the upper ring with stone from the old fort wall come spring. Calvin handed her a cup of the bitter chicory coffee he brewed each evening, and she took it without comment, drinking it down as if it were the finest thing she had tasted in years. "I don't understand you," he admitted, sitting beside her, close enough to feel the heat still radiating off her from the day's labor. "You came here to burn me out. Instead, you saved my hand's life and fixed my well. I came here to frighten you off a ridge that means nothing to the man who hired me," she said, "except as a means to steal water rights from a settler with no one to speak for him." She turned her head, and in the low orange light of the setting sun her eyes looked less like broken glass and more like something warmer, banked coals rather than shards. "I have frightened enough men off enough land in my life, Calvin Warren. I find I have grown tired of it." He did not know what to say to that, so instead he said the only thing that felt true: "I'm glad you're tired of it tonight." Something that was almost a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, quickly hidden. "Do not thank me yet. Josiah Pruitt does not pay half in advance for nothing. He will send someone to ask why his fence is still standing and his settler still breathing." She was right, of course. It took 4 days. Calvin was at the forge when the riders came, 3 men on tired horses with Pruitt himself in front, a heavy-set man in a fine wool coat entirely wrong for frontier country, his mustache waxed to sharp points, his eyes flicking nervously toward the orc woman who stood in the yard with her arms crossed, blocking the path to the cabin as surely as a drawn blade. "Snaga." Pruitt's voice cracked slightly on the name. "I paid you good silver to see this land emptied. Instead, I hear from my own riders that you've been playing carpenter for this settler." "You paid me to frighten him," Snaga said evenly. "I have decided the fright is not worth the coin. Take your silver elsewhere, Pruitt." Pruitt's face went a dark, ugly red. "That is not how this arrangement works, and you know it. Orcs who break contract in this territory do not find much work afterward. Word travels. Let it travel." Her voice dropped lower, and Calvin, standing at the edge of the yard with his hammer still in hand, felt the temperature of the moment change entirely, felt the way her whole body had gone still and dangerous, coiled like a spring. Or does the great Josiah Pruitt intend to collect his debt by force? I would enjoy that conversation far more than this one. None of the 3 riders moved. Pruitt's jaw worked silently for a moment, and then he wheeled his horse hard, spraying gravel. "This isn't finished," he called back over his shoulder. "Not for you, Warren, and not for you, Orc, mark that." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and Calvin let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "He'll try something else," he said. "He will." Snaga turned to look at him, and there was something almost gentle beneath the roughness of her expression, an offer she seemed almost reluctant to make aloud. "Do you want me to stay until he does?" Calvin looked at her, really looked, past the axe and the leather, and the tusks that still made something old and fearful stir in the back of his mind, down to the woman who had climbed into a collapsing well for a stranger, who had rebuilt a wall with her bare hands rather than let it fall on someone else's head, who had just turned down a rich man's silver because the terror it demanded no longer sat easy with her. "I want you to stay," he said, "because I want you here, not just because of Pruitt." Her eyes widened just slightly, and for one long moment neither of them spoke. Then she stepped closer, until she stood near enough that he had to tilt his head back to hold her gaze, near enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her like a low fire. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Calvin Warren, to say such a thing to a woman who breaks fences for a living." "Maybe I'm both," he said. "I'm a blacksmith who staked a claim on a haunted ruin at the edge of the map because no one else wanted it. Foolish comes with the trade." She laughed then, a short, surprised bark of sound that seemed to startle even her, and the last of the tension between them dissolved into something warmer, something neither of them had a name for yet, but both of them recognized all the same. That night, after Tobias had gone to sleep in the cabin's second room, and the fire in the forge had burned down to embers, Calvin found her sitting on the low stone wall that ringed the old fort's collapsed gate, looking out over the dark valley below the ridge. "Why did you really stop?" he asked, sitting beside her. At the well, you could have let him fall. Prut would have paid you the same either way. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered. My clan was driven from 3 valleys before I was old enough to carry a blade. I have spent most of my life being paid by men like Prut to make other people feel what my people felt then. I told myself it was only coin, only work, and did not think too hard about the rest. She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight her face seemed almost soft. Then I looked down that well and saw an old man about to die because a rich fool wanted a spring of water, and I thought, I am so tired of being the fear in other people's stories. I wanted for once to be something else. Calvin reached over, slow and deliberate, and covered her hand with his own where it rested on the cold stone. She did not pull away. You're something else to me already, he said quietly. Whatever that means, whatever it turns out to be. She turned her hand beneath his until their fingers laced together, rough calluses against rough calluses, and for a long while they simply sat like that, 2 people who had every reason in the world to distrust one another, choosing instead to hold on. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them spoke aloud, but both of them protected fiercely. Snaga did not leave. She helped Calvin haul stone from the ruined fort walls to shore up the well's upper ring, and in the evenings she sat by his forge and watched him work, the hammer ringing bright and clean against the anvil as he shaped blades from raw steel hunting knives, a fine saber for a rancher 2 days' ride south, a set of shears for the seamstress in the trading post at the base of the ridge. She had never seen a human work with such patient care, and she told him so. Most men swing a hammer like they are trying to kill the metal, she said one evening, watching sparks fly as he folded a blade back on itself for the 3rd time. You work like you are trying to convince it to become something better than it was. That's the trick of good steel, he said, not looking up from his work. You don't force it. You heat it until it's willing to change, and then you shape it while it's soft enough to listen. She watched him a long while after that, something thoughtful in her eyes, and did not answer, though later that night, when he finally set the hammer down and turned to find her still there, still watching. She crossed the space between them without a word and kissed him hard, sudden, her hand fisting in the front of his shirt as though she meant to make certain he could not pull away even if some foolish part of him wanted to. He did not want to. He kissed her back with all the pent-up longing of a man who had spent years alone on the edge of the map, who had told himself the ache of it did not matter, who had never once expected the universe to send him someone who looked at him the way she did now, like he was worth wanting, worth choosing, worth staying for. When she finally broke away, breathing hard, her forehead against his, she laughed low in her throat. I did not come here for this. No, he agreed, his hands finding her waist, steady despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. But I'm glad it found us anyway. They might have had longer, might have had weeks of quiet evenings and stolen kisses, and the slow, sweet unfolding of something neither of them had dared to name yet, if Josiah Prut had been a patient man. He was not. It happened on a market day, 11 days after the well, when Calvin rode down to the trading post at the base of the ridge to sell a wagon load of finished blades, and Snaga rode with him, unwilling to let him travel the road alone with Prut's threat still hanging unresolved. The trading post sat at the crossroads below the ridge, a cluster of log buildings around a dusty square, a general store, a smithy that had gone quiet since old Marrow died the winter before, a saloon with a sagging porch, and a notice board where the circuit rider posted news of taxes and land grants, and, that particular morning, something else entirely. A crowd had gathered around the notice board before they had even finished tying off the horses. Calvin felt the mood of the square shift the moment they walked into it, heads turning, voices dropping, the particular hush that comes before violence rather than after it. Warren, called a voice from the crowd, Elmer Coates, who ran the general store and who Calvin had thought until that moment to be something like a friend. You'd best come see this. The notice was fresh, the ink still faintly glossy in the morning light, and it bore a rough charcoal sketch of a broad-shouldered orc woman with a braid and 2 curved tusks, close enough to Snaga that there could be no mistaking the intent. Wanted for the murder of Land Assessor Elias Grant. The notice read in heavy block letters, reward of 200 silver, paid by order of the Provincial Land Office. The orc known as Snaga Rageborn is dangerous and armed. Approach with caution. Calvin's stomach dropped through the floor of the world. That's a lie, he said, too loud, his voice cracking across the square. She's been on my ridge for the past 11 days. I can vouch for every one of them. Grant was found 3 days ago, Elmer said, not unkindly, but with the particular caution of a man who did not want to be seen taking the wrong side. Throat opened by something with a blade wider than any knife. Prute's men say they saw an orc riding hard away from Grant's cabin the night it happened. Said it matched her description exact. Prute's men, Snaga said very quietly, and Calvin heard the fury banked beneath the calm of her voice, felt it radiating off her like heat off a forge. Of course they did. The crowd around the notice board was shifting now, drawing back from her, whispers rising into something uglier. A man Calvin didn't recognize, one of the drifters who worked the harvest for whatever farm would take him, spat into the dust near her boots. Elias Grant held the water rights ledger for this whole territory, Snaga said, raising her voice now, forcing the crowd to hear her over their own fear. He was the only man who could confirm whether Prute's claim to my client's ridge was legal. He is dead now, conveniently, and I am blamed for it conveniently by the very man whose coin I refused 11 days ago. Does that not strike any of you as more than chance? She would say that, wouldn't she? Someone muttered. 200 silver, said another voice, quieter, calculating. Calvin felt the crowd's mood curdle fully into something dangerous. Saw hands drift toward belt knives and the stocks of hunting rifles slung over shoulders. Saw the particular hunger in men's eyes when a bounty and an old prejudice met in the same breath. He stepped in front of Snaga without thinking, planting himself between her and the nearest of the armed men, his own hand closing around the hilt of the finest blade he had ever forged, the one he wore at his own hip more from habit than expectation of using it. The first man who draws steel on her draws it on me too, he said, and his voice did not shake, though his heart was slamming against his ribs hard enough to hurt. I've known this woman 11 days, and I know more of her character in that time than I know of half of you after years. She saved Tobias Fenn's life. She rebuilt my well with her own hands. She turned down Prute's silver rather than terrorize an honest settler. Whoever killed Elias Grant, it was not her, and any man here who says otherwise is either a fool or a liar paid by Prute to be one. For one taut, terrible moment, nobody moved. Then Elmer Coates, of all people, stepped forward and put a hand on the nearest armed man's rifle, gently pushing the barrel down toward the dirt. Warren's not a man to lie, he said slowly. Not about something like this. Let the circuit judge sort it proper, at Stonebridge, before any coin changes hands over a woman's head. It was not enough to save them. It was enough, barely, to buy them the minutes they needed to reach the horses before the crowd's uncertain restraint curdled back into greed. Calvin swung up into his saddle, Snaga a heartbeat behind him, and they rode hard out of the square with shouts rising behind them, and, moments later, the sharp crack of a rifle shot that went wide and buried itself in the dust 20 feet short of their horses' hooves. They did not stop riding until the trading post had vanished behind the curve of the road, and the ridge itself was a shrinking shape at their backs. Stonebridge, Snaga said finally, breathing hard, her horse blowing steam into the cold morning air. The provincial marshal keeps his post there. If Grant kept a ledger, there will be a copy filed with the marshal's office records of every water claim in the territory, and Prute's forged signature on whatever he used to steal Grant's rights out from under you. If we can lay hands on proof of that forgery, we can prove motive, and prove it was Prute's men riding that night, not me. Then that's where we're going, Calvin said, without a single second of hesitation, and something in Snaga's chest went tight and warm at the immediate, unquestioning certainty of it, that he had not even considered leaving her to face this alone. "It is 3 days' hard ride," she warned, "through country that will not be kind to either of us. And there will be men looking for that bounty the whole way." "Then we'd better ride fast," Calvin said, and turned his horse north, toward the distant blue line of mountains that marked the road to Stonebridge, and did not look back. They rode through that first day and into the night, stopping only to rest the horses in a stand of pines well off the main road, sharing a cold supper of dried meat and hard bread without a fire, both of them too aware of how far a fire's light could be seen by men hunting a bounty. Snaga sat with her back against a tree trunk, axe across her knees, and watched Calvin with an unreadable expression as he checked the horse's legs for strain. "You did not have to defend me in that square," she said finally. "You could have stepped back, let the crowd believe what they wished. No one would have thought less of you for it." "I would have thought less of me," Calvin said simply, settling down beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "I don't work that way, Snaga. When something's mine to protect, I protect it. That's not a debt you owe me for, that's just who I am." "Mine to protect," she repeated softly, testing the words. "You called me yours." "Did I?" He considered that and did not take it back. "I suppose I did." She reached over in the darkness and found his hand, threading her fingers through his, tusks catching the faint starlight as she allowed herself, for just a moment, the luxury of a small smile. "Then I suppose, Calvin Warren, that you are mine as well." They rode on before dawn, pushing the horses hard along a road that grew rougher and lonelier with every mile, climbing into foothill country where the pines grew thick and the trading posts grew scarce. By the second evening, they reached the outskirts of a market town called Millhaven, a cluster of log buildings and stock pens huddled at a river crossing. And it was there, riding in tired and hungry and hoping only for a hot meal and a place to rest the horses, that they found themselves walking straight into the second great danger of their journey. The town square was packed with people, more than Calvin had expected for a settlement that size, and at the center of the crowd stood a wooden post with iron chains bolted to it. And chained to that post, bloodied and stripped to the waist despite the cold, was a young orc man who could not have been much older than 25, his wrists raw where the manacles had cut into them. A crude sign hung around his neck that read simply, "Thief." "Gar," Snaga breathed, and Calvin heard the shock in her voice, saw her whole body go rigid in the saddle. "That is Gar Stonefist. He is clankin to me, a cousin of my mother's line." A man in a stained apron stood before the chained prisoner, whip already in hand, addressing the gathered crowd in the booming voice of someone who had clearly given this speech before and enjoyed the sound of his own authority. "This orc was caught stealing grain from the mill stores 3 nights past. By the old frontier code, thieves who steal food in winter earn the lash before the rope. Let this be a lesson to any who think our stores are theirs for the taking. He did not steal that grain." Snaga's voice cut across the square like a blade, and every head turned as she swung down from her horse and strode forward, Calvin's heart lurching as he realized what she meant to do even before she did it. "Snaga," he called, low and urgent, following her down. "There's a bounty on your head. If anyone here recognizes you, then let them recognize me," she said without slowing. "I will not stand by and watch my clankin beaten for a crime he did not commit while I hide my face for fear of coin on my own head." The man with the whip turned, startled, and his eyes widened as they took in the size and bearing of her, the axe at her hip, the fury banked in her expression. "This is not your business, orc. Step back, or you'll share the post with him." "Gar Stonefist has never stolen a grain of anything in his life," Snaga said, her voice carrying across the whole square now, forcing silence out of the murmuring crowd. "He was cast out of our clan 3 winters past for refusing to raid a human settlement his war-band leader wished to burn. He has worked honest labor from town to town ever since, because no clan will take back a man who refused an order, and no town trusts an orc without one. Tell me, Who accused him of this theft? Who saw him take the grain? The man with the whip hesitated, and in that hesitation, a woman near the front of the crowd, the miller's wife, judging by the flour still dusting her apron, spoke up, her voice shaking. It was Otis Cray who accused him. Said he saw the orc at the granary door that night. But Otis Cray owes 3 months' rent on his own stall, and I saw him buying grain at market not 2 days after, coin he shouldn't have had. The crowd's mood, so certain a moment before, began to waver, whispers rising in a different key now, doubt spreading like water through cracked stone. You would take an orc's word over a bounty poster and an accuser's oath. The man with the whip demanded, but his voice had lost its certainty too. Calvin stepped up beside Snaga then, and he did not draw his blade, did not raise his voice, only stood there beside her, solid and unafraid, a settler with soot still under his fingernails, standing shoulder to shoulder with an accused woman before an armed and frightened crowd. "I've traveled with this woman for 3 days now," he said, loud enough to carry. "She had every reason to ride wide around this town, given the price on her head. Instead, she rode in to stop an innocent man from being whipped for another man's crime. That's not the act of a murderer, or of someone who doesn't care about justice. That's the act of someone who cares about it more than most of you standing here with your hands on your knives." The whip-wielder's gaze flicked between Calvin and Snaga and the restless, uncertain crowd, and something in him deflated, the theater of his authority collapsing without an audience willing to cheer it on. "Fine," he spat. "Fine. Someone fetch Otis Cray and we'll sort this proper before the circuit judge arrives next week. But get that orc out of my sight before I change my mind." Snaga did not wait to be told twice. She crossed to the post in 3 long strides and, with a single wrench of her hands, tore the chain free from the iron ring bolted into the wood. Not unlocked, not unpicked, simply torn loose by main strength, the metal groaning and snapping in a shower of rust and splinters that made half the crowd gasp and stumble backward. Gar Stonefist collapsed forward into her arms, weak from cold and blood loss, and she caught him easily, murmuring something low and fierce in the old tongue of her clan that Calvin did not understand but felt the weight of anyway. "You came back for me," Gar rasped, staring up at her in disbelief. "After 3 winters, after everything." "I did not come back," Snaga said, hauling him upright, supporting most of his weight against her own body without visible strain. "I happened to be riding through, and I found my cousin about to be whipped for a crime he did not commit. Do not mistake coincidence for sentiment, Gar Stonefist." But her eyes were wet, just slightly, in the torchlight, and Calvin, watching this fierce, guarded woman hold her lost clankin like she might never let him go again, understood that it was not coincidence at all, not really, and loved her a little more fiercely for the lie she told to protect her own tender heart. They left Millhaven within the hour, Gar wrapped in a spare blanket and riding double behind Snaga, too weak yet to manage a horse alone, and pushed on through the night toward Stonebridge, putting as many miles between themselves and the market town's uncertain goodwill as the tired horses could manage. It was on the 2nd night after Millhaven, in the rocky foothill country below the last mountain pass before Stonebridge, that the bounty hunters finally caught them. There were 5 of them, riding hard out of a stand of rocks where they had clearly been waiting, and Calvin heard the pounding of hooves and the sharp crack of a rifle shot before he had even fully registered the ambush closing around them. Gar's horse, the spare mount Snaga had bought for him in the last town they passed through, still weak from his ordeal, went down hard in the rocky scrub, throwing him clear but leaving him stunned and unable to rise, directly in the path of the oncoming riders. Gar. Snaga wheeled her horse around, but 2 of the bounty hunters were already between her and her fallen cousin, rifles leveled, and a 3rd had circled wide to come at Calvin from the flank, a coiled rope in one hand meant, Calvin realized with a lurch of dread, not to kill him but to take him captive as leverage against Snaga. "The orc woman's worth 200 silver, one of the hunters shouted, his rifle trained on Snaga's chest. The man rides with her willing, that makes him worth taking too, dead or alive, for aiding a fugitive. Drop the axe, orc, or we start with him. Calvin did not hesitate. He drove his horse forward, directly into the path of the man with the rope, close enough to grab the barrel of the rifle the man carried at his saddle and wrench it skyward as it fired, the shot cracking harmlessly into the night sky. The hunter cursed and swung the rope instead, catching Calvin across the shoulder and nearly hauling him from the saddle, and in the chaos of the horses screaming and rearing, Calvin felt himself go down hard into the rocky scrub, the wind knocked from his lungs, his vision swimming. Calvin. He had never heard Snaga scream before. It tore out of her like something physical, and through the haze of pain he saw her come off her own horse in a single fluid leap, axe already swinging, meeting the hunter who had unhorsed him with a blow that sent the man's rifle spinning away into the dark. She did not stop to check if he was down. She turned in the same motion, meeting the second hunter's charge with her bare forearm blocking his knife thrust, twisting his wrist until the blade dropped, driving her fist into his jaw with enough force to fold him where he stood. Gar, recovering enough to act, tackled the third hunter from behind, and between the two of them the ambush collapsed within seconds into a rout, the two remaining riders wheeling their horses and fleeing back into the rocks rather than face an orc enforcer who fought like the ending of the world. Snaga did not chase them. The moment the immediate threat scattered, she turned back to where Calvin lay struggling to rise and dropped to her knees in the rocky dirt beside him, hands roaming over his shoulders, his ribs, his face, checking him for injury with a desperation that had nothing calculated left in it at all. Calvin, look at me. Are you hurt? Tell me where. I'm fine, he managed, though his shoulder throbbed where the rope had caught him and his ribs ached from the fall. Snaga, I'm fine, I promise you. She did not seem to hear him at first. Her hands kept moving frantic, until finally they found his face and cupped it between her palms, and he looked up into her eyes and saw something raw and unguarded there, something that had clearly cost her greatly to let show. You threw yourself at an armed man to protect my cousin, she said, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed, all the fierce control of the fight draining out of her at once. You could have died. Do you understand that? You could have died, and she broke off, breathing hard, her forehead dropping to rest against his. I couldn't let him take me without a fight, Calvin said softly, one hand coming up to rest against her wrist, holding her there. Not when it would have meant using me against you. I'd rather take a beating than be the reason you're caught, Snaga. Do not, she said fiercely, ever do that again. Do you understand me? I have buried enough people I love to build a wall with their bones. I will not add you to that count. I forbid it. Loved, Calvin repeated quietly, and something in the words seemed to catch in the air between them, unavoidable now that it had been spoken. Snaga went very still, realizing what she had said, and for a moment Calvin thought she might retreat behind the old walls, deny it, claim some warrior's excuse for the word slipping free. Instead, she let out a long, shaking breath and closed the last inch of distance between them, kissing him there in the cold, rocky dirt with a hunger that had nothing careful left in it, her hands fisting in his shirt, his arms coming up around her waist to pull her closer, both of them tangled together on the ground with their hearts still slamming from the fight and from something far more dangerous than any bounty hunter had ever posed. I love you, she said against his mouth, rough and unpolished and utterly certain, the words of a woman who did not know how to say such things gently but had decided in this moment that gently no longer mattered. I did not intend to. I have spent my whole life being paid to be feared, Calvin Warren, and you looked at a fence I destroyed and told me I had not scared you at all. I have not been the same since. I love you too, he said, and laughed, breathless with relief and joy tangled together, holding her face in his hands the way she had held his. I think I started loving you the moment you jumped down that well without even asking if the rope would hold. Gar, standing a short distance away and pointedly examining the horse's tack, cleared his throat loudly. "If the two of you are quite finished, nearly dying, and then declaring undying devotion in the middle of an ambush site, I believe we should move before those men return with reinforcements." Snaga laughed against Calvin's mouth, a sound of pure, unguarded happiness that seemed to surprise even her, and helped him to his feet, and the three of them rode on into the night toward Stonebridge with something new and unbreakable settled between them, forged in the same fire as everything else that mattered in either of their lives. They reached Stonebridge on the fourth morning after leaving Millhaven, and the town spread out below the last mountain pass in a way that made Calvin's chest tighten with cautious hope. A proper walled settlement, larger than anything he had seen since leaving the coast years before, with a stone garrison keep at its center flying the provincial banner, and streets busy with wagons and traders, and the ordinary business of people who had not yet heard whatever lies Josiah Prout had spent good silver spreading. The marshal, a weathered man named Aldous Ray's with a gray mustache and tired eyes that had clearly seen every kind of frontier trouble there was to see, listened to their story in his office with a patience that surprised Calvin, given the bounty poster still sitting on the corner of his desk. Elias Grant filed water rights records with this office every season for 12 years, Marshal Rays said. Once Snaga had finished laying out the whole of it, Prout's hire, her refusal, the murder, the frame. If Prout forged a transfer of rights, there will be a discrepancy in the filing, provided the real ledger still exists somewhere and hasn't been destroyed along with Grant himself. "It exists," Snaga said. "Grant kept duplicate ledgers always in case fire or theft claimed the originals. He told me so himself the one time I met him, when Prout first hired me and I rode to Grant's cabin to learn the truth of the Ridge's water rights before I agreed to the job. He said the second ledger was kept at his sister's homestead outside town, for safekeeping." Marshal Rays sat forward, interest sharpening in his tired eyes. "You went to verify the claim before taking the job." "I do not take contracts on faith," Snaga said simply. "Not anymore. I have been lied to by paying men too many times." It took 2 more days to send a rider to Grant's sister's homestead and bring back the second ledger, 2 days in which Calvin and Snaga stayed in a rented room above the Stonebridge Tavern, unable to fully relax even within the walls of the provincial marshal's own town, until the rider returned with a leather-bound book that, when opened before Marshal Rays's own eyes, showed exactly what they had hoped it would: a water rights transfer for Calvin Warren's Ridge, dated weeks before Grant's murder. Signed and witnessed and entirely legitimate, directly contradicting a second, forged document that Prout's lawyer had already tried to file with the provincial office claiming the rights had passed to Prout instead. "This is enough to bring Prout in for forgery at the very least," Marshal Rays said grimly, comparing the 2 documents side by side, "and enough to raise serious doubt about his men's account of the murder. I'll ride out with a proper posse and bring him in for questioning. If his men crack under pressure, and men like that usually do, once their employer's coin dries up, we'll have our murderer, and it won't be you, Miss Rageborn." It took another week for the full truth to unravel. Prout arrested at his own homestead, his hired riders confessing under the marshal's questioning that they had killed Grant on Prout's order and planted false witness against Snaga to cover the crime and collect a tidy bounty besides. But when it was done, when the notice board in Stonebridge's own square finally bore a fresh posting declaring Snaga Rageborn cleared of all charges and Josiah Prout bound for trial on charges of murder and forgery both, Calvin felt something in his chest unclench that had been wound tight since the moment he'd first seen that terrible notice back in the Trading Post Square. They rode back to the ridge together in the last golden days of autumn, Gar riding with them now, having nowhere else he wished to be and no clan willing to take him back, and the ruined fort's broken towers came into view against a sky streaked orange and violet, and Calvin felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he was riding towards something rather than simply enduring the ride. Tobias Fenn met them at the cabin door, leg mostly healed, worry etched into every line of his weathered face until he saw them and broke into a relieved grin. "Thought you'd both gone and gotten yourselves killed," he said. "Or worse, forgotten an old man needs his supper." "Never," Snaga said, swinging down from her horse with an ease that made Calvin's heart ache with fondness. "Would I forget a man I dragged up out of a well with my own 2 hands? That would be a terrible waste of good effort." That evening, as the sun set over the ridge and the well stood solid and repaired at the yard's center, exactly where Snaga had rebuilt it weeks before, Calvin found her standing at the edge of the old fort's ruined gate, looking out over the valley the way she had that very first night. "What happens now?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Prute's gone. The bounty's lifted. You could go anywhere you wanted, Snaga. You don't have anyone hunting you anymore." "I know," she said quietly. "That is exactly why I intend to stay exactly where I am." She turned to face him fully then, and something in her bearing had changed, a kind of resolve settling over her that Calvin had not seen before, even in the heart of the ambush on the road. She reached up and unclasped something from the leather cord at her throat, a small carved bead of dark bone, one of several she wore, each marked with symbols he did not recognize. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "No," he admitted. "Among my clan, before we were scattered across 3 valleys and left to find our own ways in a world that fears us, there was a right for claiming, for a warrior to declare, before witnesses, that she had chosen a mate and would defend that choice against any who challenged it, be it clan law or human law or the whole of the world standing against her." She turned the bead over in her fingers, and for the first time since he had known her, Calvin saw something like nervousness flicker across her fierce features. "It has not been performed in my clan in a generation. Most who remembered the words are dead or scattered. I only remember it because my grandmother taught it to me as a child, before the raids, before everything." "Snaga," Calvin said softly, understanding beginning to dawn. "I am an orc enforcer with a bounty poster's ghost still haunting half the trading posts in this territory, and you are a human bladesmith who staked his claim on a ruin nobody else wanted," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she did not try to hide. "By every law either of our peoples ever wrote, we should not fit together at all. And yet I have never in my life felt more certain of anything than I do standing here with you." Word had traveled ahead of them, somehow, the way news always does in frontier country, perhaps carried by the rider who had gone to fetch Grant's ledger, or by Tobias Fenn's own letters to his kin in the valley below, or simply by the strange magic that carries a good story faster than any horse can run. Whatever the cause, by the time the following evening came, a small crowd had gathered at the base of the ridge and begun the climb up toward Calvin's cabin. Elmer Coates from the trading post, curious and a little sheepish about his earlier hesitation. The miller's wife from Millhaven, who had ridden 2 days out of her way, once she heard the bounty had been lifted, wanting to see how the story ended. Marshal Reyes himself, who had business in the territory regardless and admitted freely, he did not want to miss this. And most remarkable of all, 3 orc riders who had heard through channels older and quieter than any human gossip that Snaga Rageborn once feared across half the frontier. As an enforcer for hire, intended to perform the oldest rite of her scattered clan on a ridge at the edge of the map, Snaga stood at the center of the fort's broken gate as the sun sank low and gold over the valley, dressed still in the same fitted black leather she had worn the day she came to terrify Calvin off his land, the crimson underlayer catching the last of the light like a banked coal. Gar stood at her side, solemn in a way Calvin had not yet seen from him, having appointed himself witness and kin both, the only blood tie she had left in all the world. Calvin stood before her, his heart hammering so hard he was certain the whole gathered crowd could hear it, and watched as Snaga Rageborn orc enforcer, terror of a dozen trading posts, the woman who had climbed into a collapsing well without a second thought, and torn a chain from an iron post with her bare hands, sank slowly to one knee before him in the dirt of the ruined fort's gate, before every witness gathered there, human and orc alike. "Calvin Warren," she said, her voice carrying clear and unshaking across the hushed crowd, "I was hired to drive you from this ridge, and instead I found a reason to stay upon it that no coin could ever have bought. I have broken more contracts than I can count in this life, but I break none so gladly as the one that would have kept me from you. Before my clankin, before your people, before the ruins of a fort that neither of us built but both of us have chosen to call home, I claim you as mine not as a possession, but as a promise. I will stand at your side against any danger this world sends, be it a mob's fear or a rich man's greed or the whole of an unkind world's prejudice. I will defend your forge and your well, and your foolish, stubborn heart for as long as breath remains in me. This is Snaga Rageborn's oldest vow, and I make it to you freely, wanting nothing in return but the chance to keep making it every day for the rest of my life." Calvin's throat was too tight to speak for a long moment, and when he finally found his voice, it came out rough and unashamed, loud enough for the whole gathered crowd to hear. "I'm just a bladesmith who staked a claim on a ruin because nobody else wanted it," he said. "I never expected anyone to choose me for anything, let alone a woman who could have gone anywhere, been anything, feared by everyone who crossed her. But you climbed down a well for a stranger and rebuilt a wall with your own hands and stood between me and a mob without a second thought, and every single day since you have chosen to stay. I don't have some old right to answer yours with Snaga. All I have is this." He knelt too, so they were level so he could take her hands in his before the whole watching crowd. "I choose you back, today and tomorrow and every day after that for as long as you'll have me." Snaga Rageborn rose to her feet and pulled him up with her, and kissed him there before the gathered witnesses with a fierce, open joy that needed no translation in any tongue, human or orc, and the small crowd gathered at the ruined gate broke into a ragged cheer that startled the crows from the old fort's broken towers, sending them wheeling up into the last gold light of the sunset. Gar clapped Calvin on the shoulder hard enough to nearly stagger him. "Welcome to a very small, very stubborn clan, blacksmith," he said, grinning. "I hope you like well repairs. I have a feeling you will be doing many more of them in the years to come, whether the well requires it or not." "I'll take that trade," Calvin said, laughing, Snaga's hand warm and certain in his own. "Gladly, every single time." They rebuilt the ridge together in the seasons that followed, not merely the well or the fence, but the whole broken shell of the old fort, stone by stone, until what had once been ruins became something like a home, a settlement other travelers began to speak of with a kind of wondering respect. The ridge where a human bladesmith and an orc enforcer had chosen each other over every reason the world offered them not to, and made something lasting out of stone and steel and stubborn, unshakable love. Marshal Reyes rode through twice a year thereafter, always with some excuse of provincial business, though everyone including him understood it was mostly to see how the ridge had grown. Tobias Fenn stayed on, too fond of the place and its people to leave, and grew old their content. Gar Stonefist found, in time, that a clan did not always need blood to hold it together, and made his own home in the ridge's shadow, his chains long since melted down in Calvin's forge and reshaped into something far more useful hinges for the cabin's new door, the one Snaga had insisted on building wide enough for both their shoulders to pass through together. And on quiet evenings, when the forge fire burned low and the stars came out thick and bright over the ridge, Calvin Warren would often find Snaga Rageborn sitting at the edge of the old fort's rebuilt wall, looking out over the valley she had once been paid to help clear of him, and he would sit beside her, and take her hand, and think that of all the strange turns a life could take, none had ever felt half so right as this one, the terror hired to drive him off his own land, staying instead to become the truest home he had ever known.